In the year 1628, the ship Batavia set sail from Holland. It was no ship, it was a promise. The crown jewel of the Dutch East India Company, a floating wooden cathedral, its hull overflowing with treasures, 12 chests of silver, jewels destined for a sultan, and the hope of a new life for the 300 souls on board. Under the command of the experienced Francis Pelsaert, its journey was a symbol of the arrogance and power of the Dutch Golden Age, a nation that believed it had dominated the oceans and, with them, its own destiny. On board, besides soldiers, sailors, and settler families, traveled a man named Jeronimus Cornelisz. He was not a sailor. He was a bankrupt apothecary from Haarlem, fleeing debts and suspicion of involvement with a circle of heretics. Cornelisz was a man who had lost faith in God, in society, and in morality itself. He was a disciple of the shadows, a man who believed that the laws governing men were mere chains, and that a truly superior man was above them. He traveled to the east in search of new fortune, but carried within him a gospel of nihilism, a seed of darkness awaiting the right soil to germinate. For months the Batavia sailed, a small universe of order and hierarchy floating above the chaos of the ocean. But on June 4, 1629, in the darkness of night, the universe disintegrated. With the deafening sound of 1,000 trees breaking, the Batavia violently collided with a coral reef off the uncharted coast of Western Australia. The silver cathedral's hull was ripped open. The icy waters of the Indian Ocean surged into the holds, swallowing the promise of wealth. The ship did not sink immediately, but remained trapped, slowly breaking apart under the fury of the waves. The panic was apocalyptic. Amidst the screams and darkness, some 180 survivors managed to reach a small, desolate coral island nearby, a barren piece of land, without drinking water, without food, and without shelter. They had survived the shipwreck. They had escaped the abyss of the ocean. But unknowingly they had only exchanged one trap for another, for the true terror was not in the waters around them. It was about to disembark, walking among them. The sinking of the Batavia was over. Hell was only beginning. In the early days, order, however fragile, prevailed. Commander Pelsaert, along with his most senior officers and a small group, made a desperate but logical decision. They would set sail in the only intact lifeboat on an impossible journey of over 3,000 kilometers to the Dutch colony of Batavia, present-day Jakarta, to seek help. It was their only hope of rescue. Upon leaving, they promised to return. For the survivors left behind on the island, their departure was not only the loss of their leaders, it was the creation of a vacuum of power, of law, and of hope. And it is in the vacuum that monsters flourish. With Pelsaert broken, leadership fell to Jeronimus Cornelisz. He was not a soldier, not a born leader, but he possessed something far more powerful, a philosophy, the philosophy of the abyss. Cornelisz saw the island not as a prison, but as an opportunity, a blank slate, a laboratory where he could finally put his heretical beliefs into practice, that without God and without law, there is neither good nor evil, only will. And his will was that of a god. He didn't seize power by force. He seduced it. He began to gather a circle of followers, men who, like him, felt wronged by life, men whose souls were already hardened by greed and cruelty. He united them with whispers in the dark, with promises of power, of food, of women. He convinced them that on that forgotten island, they were no longer servants of the East India Company. They were the new masters. His first act as leader was that of a manipulative genius. Under the pretext of searching for water and resources, he divided the survivors. He sent a group of soldiers loyal to the commander, led by a simple and honorable man named Weeby Hayes, to a neighboring island, ordering them not to return until he signaled them. It was a death sentence disguised as a mission. With the only men capable of militarily resisting exiled, the main island was now under his absolute control. With the guardians out of the way, Cornelisz and his mutineers began to consolidate their power. They confiscated all weapons. They rationed the scarce food and water, using hunger as a tool of control. The fragile society of survivors became a tyranny, and, like all tyrannies, it needed a purge to maintain itself. The island was about to become a sacrificial altar for the nihilistic philosophy of its new god. The first murder was the breaking of the last seal of civilization. It was the transition from conspiracy to open massacre. A young cabin boy was tried for a trivial crime and sentenced to death. It was a test. Cornelisz wanted to see if his men would have the courage to cross the final line. They did, and once the first blood was spilled, the dam broke. What followed was not a fight for survival. It was a systematic extermination. The island became the stage for Cornelisz's philosophy in action. He and his followers initiated a reign of terror, a purge to eliminate all those deemed useless or a potential threat. The sick and wounded were the first to go. They were dragged onto the rocks and drowned, their deaths justified as an act of mercy. Then they began killing for sport. Men were falsely accused of crimes and executed. Others were simply stabbed in their sleep. Entire families were exterminated. Women were turned into sex slaves, distributed among the mutineers. The island, an initial place of hope, became an open-air slaughterhouse, a kingdom ruled by the sadistic will of a psychopathic apothecary. In a few weeks, Cornelisz and his cult of killers massacred more than 120 men, women, and children. While hell raged on the main island, a miracle unfolded on the neighboring island. Faber Hayes and his soldiers, against all odds, found a source of potable water and an abundance of kangaroos to hunt. They survived and thrived. When terrified survivors managed to escape Cornelisz Island and reach Hayes, the truth of the massacre was revealed. Weber Hayes, an ordinary soldier with no leadership aspirations, became the antithesis of Cornelisz. He was order against chaos, duty against depravity. He and his men, using improvised materials, built a small stone fort and prepared for war. They were humanity's last bastion. The battle for the souls of the Batavia survivors began. Cornelisz, knowing his tyranny was threatened, launched mass attacks against Fort Hayes. The assassins, armed with the ship's swords and muskets, faced the soldiers, armed with improvised spears and a determination born of horror. The fighting was brutal. It was a miniature civil war, fought at the end of the world, between a cult of nihilistic assassins and a small band of men who refused to let the darkness win. At the height of the final battle, when Hayes and his men were about to be subdued, a dot appeared on the horizon. A sail. Commander Pelsart, against all odds, had succeeded. He had reached Batavia and was returning with a rescue ship. Pelsart's arrival was not a scene of relief, but of even deeper horror. He found a civil war raging on a deserted island, and slowly, through the testimonies of terrified survivors, the full scale of the massacre was revealed. The trial began right there, on those bloodied islands. Justice was as medieval and brutal as the crimes. Cornelisz and his main followers were tortured to obtain confessions. Their right hands were amputated with a hammer and chisel. And then they were hanged one by one, their bodies swaying in the ocean breeze, a grotesque end to a reign of terror. The apostle of nihilism, the man who believed himself above morality, met his end at the end of a rope, subject to the same human law he so despised. The sinking of the Batavia is more than a story of survival. It is one of the most terrifying and pure social experiments in history. That island was not just a piece of land. It was a laboratory. A laboratory that removed all the variables of civilization, law, government, religion, society, and left only the human being in its rawest state. And the result was a monster. The story haunts us because we cannot simply dismiss Jeronimus Cornelisz as a demon, an aberration. He was a man, a product of his culture, who, freed from all constraints, chose to become a god of his own hell. And what is even more frightening, he found other men willing to follow him. The Batavia forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How thin is the layer of civilization that protects us from the darkness? What prevents us from becoming Jeronimus or his followers if the lights go out and the rules disappear? The story of that shipwreck is a mirror. It reflects a dark truth about the fragility of order and the potential for tyranny that lies dormant, not in fairy tale monsters, but in the human heart. The Batavia revealed not just an island of rock and sand, it revealed an island within the human soul, a place where, in the absence of God and law, anyone can crown themselves king of a kingdom of bones.